Dedut Cave Meal Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. I'm sorry I'm so late getting started to this today. I had company. My two eldest daughters came. It's about a 3-hour trip for them one way, and they left the husbands and the grandchildren. And they actually came, if you notice, this big blank space on the wall. My daughter, who does all the macrame, is having an art show. She's having her macrame wares show here in the next little bit of time. And she took my my creation back. So watch this spot because she's going to make me a different one and hang it up there. So our book, it's time for our book. And there was something that I was going to mention. Oh, I remember. My God, it's a miracle. Tonight, no matter where you are in the world, so I hope I'm not too late for some people, 8:30 your time tonight, turn out all of your lights for an hour. It's in recognition of climate change. It's a gesture towards green technology, and just turn out your lights. They're doing it all over the world so that it will happen sequentially as areas arrive at 8:30 p.m. So try to remember that. So our book tonight is one of a couple that I'm going to do in the next couple of weeks. I've got a different book planned for next week. If it had arrived on time, we would have been doing it today. I'm delighted that I ordered it. It's the best book. It's so good. I think you'll love it, but that's not what we're doing today. I want to cover the topic of reincarnation because I think it's really an important subject and not always necessarily, not completely understood by anybody really. Part of almost all religious and spiritual beliefs, either in the past or still. And it has been looked at pretty closely over time. Now, this particular book, which I got secondhand, so it looks a little rough, Past Lives by Peter and Elizabeth Fenwick. You might recognize the name. He's the one whose book we did a few weeks ago about near-death experiences and then dreams, the two books we did. This book was written in 1999, so it's already over 20 years old. And so the science in it is probably not as completely cutting edge. Let's hope it's not. But that doesn't diminish this book at all. And I thought it would be kind of an easy introduction into the topic in general. Now, Peter Fenwick is a neurophysiologist, neurobiologist, doesn't say here. Here we go. A psychiatrist and a neurophysiologist, and his wife is a professional writer. So they work together quite a bit. So in this book, he discusses some cases, and I more or less get into the details. A lot of them I didn't even get into the details. It was too difficult because it went on for pages and pages and pages. It was scattered. It was interspersed with commentary and references to the science. And so I tried to condense this into a more presentable format. And if you really want to know the personal stories about people more in detail than what I go through, then I would really recommend this book. So Past Lives, written in 1999 by Peter and Elizabeth Fenwick. And the book starts out in the introduction by trying to define the soul, or at least the soul as he intends when he mentions it in the book. He says, the soul is a vehicle able to carry aspects of an individual, like memory and personality, from one life to another incarnation. And what I really enjoyed about this book was his continual willingness to challenge people's assumptions that, this is all completely real and legitimate, and reincarnation is, as the term is used, is all about reliving lives and remembering older lives, the um, oh God, what's the word? When you go back into a body. One soul goes into a new body and again and again and again, and then you remember something from a past life. That's basically what he means by reincarnation. And he's not necessarily saying, not necessarily making judgments. Is that truly what happens? He's questioning every aspect of it, and he does it from a scientific point of view. And I really appreciate that. I think it's too easy to be gullible. Now, that doesn't mean I don't believe in it or that I do believe in it. It just means I like to approach any conundrum with an open mind and good scientific technique if it's possible. So he says that the concept of the soul and the concept of past lives and regression and reincarnation all depend on two things: your culture, context, and your particular religious belief system or philosophical belief system or lack thereof, you know. In Western thought, excuse me, we used to think of reincarnation as occurring sequentially in linear time, and science now regards this as flawed because science doesn't regard time as linear anymore. Reincarnation is basically the transmigration, that's the word I was looking for, the transmigration of the soul, and it occurs in almost all religious beliefs, that you live, you're born, you live, as an individual you die, but what makes you that individual with your memories and personality and character traits move on to another body. That's the basic idea. In Egypt, for example, they believed in reincarnation. And the reason that they started making mummies was to delay the process of reincarnation, to give you time to do what you need to do in the afterlife. 6th century BC, the Greeks believed that the Titans, who were the children of Uranus and Gaia, these Titans were destroyed by Zeus as a punishment, and that human beings, man, sprang from the ashes of this fiery death of the Titans, and that the titanic component in us, in humanity, is the evil in us, or as Christians later called it, the original sin. And that man's job was to conquer this titanic element to achieve divine status, to get over the ashes of the Titans, get rid of the bad stuff, and improve to a point of deification. And in that quest, the soul is recycled over and over until it finally reaches a state of perfection, and it's considered a state of bliss, a happy release of struggle. It all sounds very similar to many other cultural and religious notions. Plato believed the soul was immortal, that it existed and was immortal, and he believed that there were a fixed number of souls that regularly reincarnated. And you can find references to reincarnation in Pythagoras, in Roman writing, for example, Virgil. The Romans believed that the soul was able to go in and out of the body during sleep, often as a bird. And in death, because of death, it was able to move on. And Germany, for example, they believed that your soul could leave your body at death and then go into a sibling's brother's heart and give that brother twice as much courage as he had before. One of the reasons in many cultures it's taboo to name a new baby the same as a living family member because of reincarnation. They believe that's bad juju. If you have the same name, you have the same soul, one of them could die. The Druids believed in reincarnation, but they didn't necessarily believe that the purpose of reincarnation was to better the soul or to purify the soul or to improve it. They just thought it happened. Some cultures believe that witches and magicians, maybe musicians, magicians could move their souls to hide from enemies or danger inside plants or animals to be safe. And when they did that, and they were hiding their soul in something other than their own body, the owner could not be destroyed. Souls and reincarnation figure heavily in human myth. People believe that you could reincarnate as a plant or an animal. In Tristan and Isolde, the trees, they became the trees. Ajax, his blood became flowers. So there was a lot of this sense of the human spirit able to move into other objects other than human. In Asia, they believed your soul could move into crops, and that this could delay, you could delay this happening. So they believed that your soul could move into a crop, but it's the wrong season. So they figured they could delay that from happening by smoking, as in a smokehouse, the corpse and drying it, and that would delay the movement of the soul. A guy called Philo Judaeus in 30 BC to 40 AD believed that only souls that avoided attachment to the world would go to God, and that the rest were reincarnated. Sounds very Eastern. The Gnostics and the Manichaeans, Christians, until the mid-6th century, believed in reincarnation. The early Christian church taught reincarnation. It wasn't until the mid-6th century, 553 AD, that they voted at the Council of Nicaea to get rid of the notion of reincarnation, and that they made reincarnation Christian heresy. But the first half a century of Christianity believed in reincarnation. The Cathars believed that if man received the Holy Spirit, which they called the Paraclete, that he could escape reincarnation. He wouldn't have to go into another life. Otherwise, at death, the soul fled to the nearest animal or human and went into that. There were two types of Cathars. The perfect ones, they were considered to possess the gift, and they became the priests. That's gift with the capital G, probably the Paraclete. The other kind of Cathars were believers, and they had to obey and adore the first kind, the perfect ones. The perfect ones, though, they didn't have it so great. They had to leave their family, they had to be vegan, they had to be celibate, and they were always put forward in danger of things like the Inquisition because they were leaders. Most believers avoided even attempting to be a perfect Cathar until their deathbed, because then what have you got to lose? By the 13th century, they were pretty much gone because of persecution and vows of celibacy. In 1875, there was a school of thought called Theosophy that was led by Madame Blavatsky. And if you remember stories of spirit table moving and booths where protoplasm, all that was these guys. Then there was a person called Sai Baba, who was a reincarnated Muslim saint from 1840 to 1918, and he's supposed to be coming back. In Buddhist and Hindu belief, reincarnation is also associated with retribution. Like if you do something really awful in this life, in your next life, when you reincarnate, you may have to pay for that in a big way. And in India, the law of karma dictates that the physical condition of each life is determined by the moral and religious character of the preceding life. So if you were really awful in a previous life, you would come back as not so good of a situation in this life. Orthodox Hindus believe that if a man leads a good life, he'll be reborn as a wealthy person and of a higher caste. So that must have been terrible in a former life. And if a person sins a lot, then he will potentially, in Orthodox Hindu, potentially reincarnate as a lower form of life, an animal. But that's not the traditional sense of reincarnation, is you're not going to come back as a dog. You don't have to worry about that. And this process continues over and over until the soul achieves salvation or perfection or bliss or detachment from the physical. It just depends on what religion you're thinking about. In Buddhism, the soul reincarnates until it achieves nirvana, which is the cessation of desire. If you're enlightened, you can remember your past lives and you can see the destinies of the departed, what new life they're going to go into. In Tibetan Buddhism, the monks were considered spiritually advanced. The lamas are able to control their next incarnation, pick out who they want to be. And they're called tulkas, and a tulka would be like the Dalai Lama. And they're chosen at birth. They're born to be the Dalai Lama, and then they have to be discovered by a search. The Lama may predict his next life, but often it's kind of a Delphic thing. It's presented in a sort of a puzzly way, a mysterious way, like a riddle or something, and you have to figure it out and interpret it. Reincarnation is the means to the eventual end, which is enlightenment, and you yet may come back, even after you achieve enlightenment, you may come back to aid others. And there are those who believe that figures like Jesus and Gandhi and Buddha and other sorts of figures like that are enlightened figures who came back to help. It's important in Tibet, these lamas are important in Tibet because they not only have spiritual power, but they also have political and economic power, and especially since China took over, they have become a focus of political leadership. The idea of reincarnation can give meaning and can explain your abilities and traits. It seems to many people to be a clear way to explain why somebody's born knowing how to play an instrument or being extremely talented at something you can hardly believe it. And they will often write that off, provided that they're predisposed to by their culture and their upbringing. They write it off as reincarnation. It's a fairly normal human desire, immortality, and some people feel it's enough to pass on their genetic material, but other people want personal survival. And then there's people like Elon Musk who wants to upload his brain into the cloud and anyway. Many people look at reincarnation kind of like recycling. Science says it's impossible. They believe that the brain generates your personality and your consciousness, and without the brain, there is no consciousness, and it's impossible for science to measure subjective personal experiences, and so they don't condone the notion of reincarnation. They don't believe in it. So let's start with chapter 1. That was all introduction. Chapter 1, some classic cases. As I said, I don't go deep into these cases the way the book does, but I do try to give you a little flavor of what's going on. Often, the memories of your past lives, should you be lucky enough to have these memories, are really hard to fact check. And that will be the factors that will determine that are things like, how long ago was that past life? Did anybody even keep records? Do you remember names and places clearly enough that they can go check records, even if they do exist? Well, we'll get into this. So the notable cases, the first one is Bridie Murphy. The search for Bridie Murphy fame. It was a book. Still very controversial, but it raises a lot of questions, and the questions are good. It's always good to question. So she was born Virginia Tighe, married to Hugh Tighe, in Pueblo, Colorado, and had a friend named Maury Bernstein. Maybe it's Maury Bernstein, the I is second, whose hobby was hypnotism, and she agreed to let him practice. And when he practiced, he got more than he anticipated. She did 6 sessions with him from November 52 to October of 1953, and told a story all the way back to a woman named Bridie Murphy in Cork, Ireland. When she spoke, she had a heavy Cork accent, and she described life in 18th century Cork. She claimed she was born in December of 1798, the daughter of a Protestant lawyer. She lived in a place called the Meadows outside Cork. She had 1 older brother and 1 younger brother who died young. At 15 years old, she went to Mrs. Strain's school, up until 15 years old. Strain's daughter, Alice, married Bridie's brother, Duncan. Bridie married Brian McCarthy, the son of a Roman Catholic lawyer. And they had 2 ceremonies. They had a Roman Catholic ceremony that they hid from her parents that was done in Belfast by a Father Gorman. And then they had a civil ceremony that her parents knew about. She died at the age of 66 of a broken hip and was buried in Belfast in 1864. Her husband wrote for the Belfast News and also taught at Queen's University. Under hypnosis, Bridie described towns and shops, naming them like Farr's Store and the greengrocer John Kerrigan. She described money in pounds, tuppence, and sixpence, which was a form of coinage that was only used in a narrow period of time during the time that she would have been alive. They tried to fact check all this stuff, and no records of births, marriages, and deaths were kept before 1864. But they were able to prove a few things. That there was a place that she named called Bailing's Cross, and it had never been on a map. It was sort of the terminology used by locals at the time, not used anymore, never on a map. There was a greengrocer called Farr's, and the money was only used for a short period of time, the tuppence. She used colloquial language, but she also mixed in modern terms, and they say that under hypnosis, this sort of mixing of styles and actual language is to be expected. There have been many attempts to discredit this whole story. People tried to say that she got her ideas from a neighbor named Bridie from her childhood. Scientists suggest that it may have been a phenomenon called cryptoamnesia, forgotten memories that you're completely unaware of until you go under hypnosis. But she wanted to remain anonymous in this book. She didn't want anyone to know about it, and she didn't want to profit from it. But somebody outed her. Somebody who was familiar with the story in her personal life reported her to journalists, and she still refused to profit from it. The writer strongly suggests that during hypnosis, some people are able to access memories belonging to other times and places and persons. And there are some theories as to how this happens, but which we'll get into. The next story is The 7 Lives of Jane Evans. A person called Arnold Bloxham made 400 tapes of regressions. A woman named Jane Evans sought out hypnosis for rheumatism, for treatment of rheumatism. And she began to talk of 7 lives that included one as a Jewish woman who was killed in a massacre in the English city of York in 1190. She regressed to 1189 in New York. She was a Jewish mother with 2 children, married to a man named Joseph, who was a moneylender. And this was before, as she described it, before the Third Crusade, where there was a huge amount of Christian fervor and anti-Jewish feeling. She had to wear a badge to show her religion, the same as Jews during the Holocaust had to wear a yellow star. This wasn't a yellow star, but it was a similar idea. She spoke only of personal experiences. She didn't really describe the history at all, which some people think lends credibility to her story because women really weren't educated and she probably wouldn't have known very much about history. She recalled the mob and fleeing from the mob and hiding inside of a church in a little area inside the church. She recalled the death of her daughter and her own death at the hands of the mob. And later, a professor of Jewish history at York University was impressed by the accuracy of her story. Now, there was debate about the details. For example, she claimed to have hidden in a crypt. And in modern times, there was no crypt where she described. But then they discovered there was an area that had been cemented over that might have been called a crypt. And the whole story of the badges, they can't prove or disprove it, but they feel like this has happened throughout history, so it wouldn't be too surprising. Her second life, she describes 1450 France. Her name was Allison, and she was an Egyptian servant to a Frenchman named Jacques Cober, a merchant prince, so somebody who had traveled to Egypt and brought her back. And she described the intrigues of the area, like the neighborhood intrigues. And she was killed when he poisoned her. But the author says that that the hypnotist who did this sort of thought perhaps this was cryptomania, and that the emotions and the hypnosis were so intense that they brought out these vivid memories. The third story is about Shanti Devi, who was 4 years old in 1930 in New Delhi, and who, this is a person, and who was very mature for a 4-year-old, kind of like a small adult, and began to talk about a previous life as somebody called Lugdi, a woman in a place called Mathura, which was 80 miles away from where the 4-year-old lived, and had died in previous years in Mathura. She described the food, the clothes, her husband, her children, her house, the flowers in her yard. Her parents took her to the doctor, and the doctor said, oh, well, this kid's got an imagination. But then, in great physiological detail, she described her death in childbirth, and it was really shocking to the adults. And they managed to question her, which doesn't usually work with children and past life memories, but they were able to get written down the details of her husband's name and the address they lived. And lo and behold, it all proved to be true. This husband, whose wife had died in childbirth, was really skeptical about this 4-year-old, and he sent his cousin undercover as a pretend businessman. And the 4-year-old took one look at him, recognized him, called him by the cousin's name, asked about the dead woman's son and details of the dead woman's life with the husband. So they brought the widowed husband and the son to this 4-year-old, and she knew them in a crowd, was able to pick them out. She reproached the husband for getting a new wife and for giving the new wife the dead woman's jewelry. She reminded him that they had agreed that he would not remarry. Gandhi even came to see her. She was tested by taking her to Mathura, and she told them how to get to the house. She showed them where she had hidden money before she died. She made 24 correct statements that they were able to verify. She made no incorrect statements. She died at the age of 61 in 1987. And they discovered that she'd been questioned at the age of 4, and was able to give a description like a near-death description, that she, but except she went all the way. And this all happened before 1970, and Raymond Moody's book about near-death experiences, it was not really a topic that people knew about or talked about, but she was able to describe it, and during the time when she described it, it was dismissed as delusional, and later, when they went back with the knowledge that Moody came out with, they realized that she perfectly described a near-death experience, except she actually died all the way. So chapter 2, glimpses of the past. It's not unusual for a past life regressive memories to pop up under hypnosis. It's not unusual. It's unusual for them to happen spontaneously without hypnosis, as they did with the 4-year-old Shanti. Sometimes these memories will emerge in illness or as a result of drugs or very strong emotion like grief. People will be in a calm frame of mind, sort of a meditative daydreaming, which is a form of hypnosis, and they will come up with these memories. But it's not commonly expected to occur in the West, and it's not always well received. At least it wasn't 25 years ago in the West, and so people tend to talk less about it. So these authors here, the Fenwicks, put out a request for stories, and they put them out in the Daily Mail, and they got more than 300 stories and discovered some interesting things. Spontaneous memories of a past life were common. Some of them began in childhood, some began as adults. Some began during a quiet time when people were daydreaming, like a self-induced trance. But they can also be triggered by a sight or a sound that evokes a memory. They sort of relate deja vu, that sense of, oh, I remember doing this before, and jamais vu, which means never having been seen, when all of a sudden the familiar seems unknown and new and strange. And they think that there's a relationship somehow between these memories and those two phenomena. About 10 years ago, Vera Schoenberg went on holiday with her husband to Egypt. Their trip included a visit to Abu Simbel. Quote, "We walked down a path with high rocks to the side of the temples, discussing them. I walked around the corner and went into total shock. I burst into tears. I was shaking. My legs had turned to jelly. I was laughing, crying. I felt happy, afraid, overwhelmed. I knew that I had come home. After I had calmed down a bit, my husband made me tell him exactly what was in the temple. I told him every detail, including the room I worked in as a high priestess to the right behind the last enormous column. When I walked up to the temple, my husband, a total non-believer, pulled behind as he said I looked different. I walked differently. I felt totally different, shorter, darker, with a fuller mouth and high cheekbones. I took much smaller steps. We entered the temple. I went into shock again, mixed with anger that common people were allowed in there, unheard of 3,000 years ago. After the guide took us around the main part, which was exactly as I saw it, he said we had half an hour to wander around. My husband asked me where my room was, and I had told him exactly as I had seen it. We went to the last pillar on the right, walked behind it, and there was my room. I had come home. I spent that time crying my eyes out. I was so happy. By the end of the day, I had remembered everything, my name, even my pet monkey, and the bedclothes and decor of my former room. When I returned home, I contacted a hypnotherapist and asked her to disprove it. She spent over an hour asking me everything about Egyptian life. I never faltered once. My husband still can't believe it. He reckons it's inherited memory. We checked all our books on Egypt to see if I had read anything about it, but no, I had not. Ancient places do often seem like they have a special atmosphere. Just to the ordinary person who's not having recall memories, there is a weight to the atmosphere. And some people respond very strongly to that. I had that experience in the archaeological museum in, it's in Italy, I can't remember, Turin. the Archaeological Museum in Turin is the biggest archaeological collection of Egyptology outside of Cairo. And I was absolutely transported. I got chills. It was a very emotional experience to see the personal possessions and artwork that I had seen in books and some I had never seen. It was really an interesting experience. In the book, there are examples of people going to foreign places and knowing the area, being able to describe places before they're actually in that place, and astounding the people that they're with. Deja vu is more common in people who have migraines or epilepsy or in anxiety states, in states of mental illness, and in people who are prone to fantasy. Aristotle and Pythagoras both thought deja vu was a function of reincarnation. The awareness of your past death is a common part of past life memories. You're not protected from this. They often include what is best described from other research as out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. Descriptions are identical. There's a close similarity between past life memories and near-death experiences, and sometimes a near-death experience that's survived will trigger memories of a past life. And interestingly, past life experiences don't happen in long linear narratives usually. They come as flashbacks, not a continuous narrative. Some people will describe having sudden fragmentary memories, brief visual images, like they'll suddenly see around them something from the past. Kids with past life memories start early, as soon as they can start talking, and they seem to stop talking about it at about 7-ish years old. However, they later admit that they kept the memories and they just were reluctant to talk about them because of reactions. Many with these memories since earliest childhood claim that they've always known that these were past lives, something that happened to them before birth into this life. They just didn't share that knowledge or talk too much about it because it wasn't well received by their present-day family. My earliest memory as a tiny child was of complete frustration at finding myself in a heavy, unresponsive body again. I had been sent back from a place where I was completely happy because I had failed in my previous life. I was going to have to live through the same life again and get it right this time. I think that this was mainly due to the fact that I always saw the future quite clearly, so that when something happened, it was as though I was living through the event for a second time. I am certain that this belief did not originate from my parents. They were entirely orthodox in their beliefs and probably had never even heard of reincarnation. I was in no doubt about why I had failed in my previous life. It was due to total fear. As a child, I used this fact to my own advantage, and on being told to carry out some task, I always replied, I couldn't do it last time that I was alive, and I won't be able to do it now. I expect my parents just hoped that I would grow out of this, which I eventually did do. However, this memory has been the mainspring of my life. As a child, if I saw drunken men fighting on the other side of the street, I had to cross over and, quaking, walk through them. It was the cause of my leaving a comfortable, happy home to go to sea when I had just left school. It was the cause of my volunteering for the armed forces at the outbreak of war when I was in a reserved occupation. It was also the reason why I volunteered for service on an active front when I was in a comfortable station in England. It was also the reason why I joined the Sussex Police at the end of the war. I hated the idea of pushing myself forward, and I knew that as a policeman I would be forced to do so. It's interesting to compare the feelings of frustration this guy had of finding himself in a heavy, unresponsive body with this extract from the autobiography of a yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda, one of the greatest spiritual figures of the 20th century. An autobiography of a yogi is a great book. I still remember the helpless humiliations of infancy. I was resentfully conscious of being unable to walk and to express myself freely. Prayerful surges arose within me as I realized my bodily impotence. Many memories are triggered by, like I said, sensory triggers. And they think this may be related to the temporal lobe of the brain. So many believe that past life experiences explain how you are in the present, why you're drawn to a place or to a culture or a particular time period, why you have a focused interest in something, time, or place. Sometimes there are generational family ties to a remembered place, and one has to ask, is this a genetic memory? Reincarnation can explain phobias. Some time periods or memories seem iconic, and people tend to gravitate towards those memories. For example, life as a Native American, life in covered wagons, life in Egypt, life on the Titanic. Of 300 stories they got, 8 were Titanic victims, which mathematically suggests that there were many more victims reincarnating than had died on the Titanic. Then there are many stories of people reincarnating from the Holocaust, and I actually just got a book about those, and if they're good, I'm going to cover those in the near future. Rabbi Yonasan Gershom wrote Beyond the Ashes, Cases of Reincarnation from the Holocaust, and many of those people reincarnated en masse is the theory. It's easy to dismiss these memories as tricks of the brain, and one asks, is there a meaning or a validity beyond a scientific explanation? You need to move outside present conventional scientific frameworks to explore this idea. You have to be open to setting aside the limitations of our scientific understanding. Interestingly enough, when this book was written, some things were not as well known then as they are now. This was 1999. Things about string theory and particle physics have evolved somewhat, and it's interesting to see that perhaps they were on the right track in this book. It's easier to find these stories in cultures that are more open to the notion of reincarnation. People are more willing to talk about it. There's probably a similar proportion of people in every culture that have these memories, but some don't talk about it or don't recognize them for what they are and don't talk about it. There's a strong link, and this is the most interesting thing at all. They've done studies, and studies have confirmed this. The numbers have confirmed, and several different studies, that there's a strong link to psychic abilities and past life memories. Some cultures encourage less impulsivity and more introspection from a young age, which may predispose somebody to be more aware of what's going on with these memories. In 1967, a Professor Ian Stevenson began the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. And he set this up to use scientific methodology to study the notion of reincarnation. And he died in 2007. But by the time this book was written, he was still alive, and he had studied more than 2,600 cases, mostly children. And he found that there did not seem to be a real consistency from culture, time, or place between incarnations. So just because you're an English milkman 100 years ago doesn't mean that you're going to be something similar. You might be a young woman in India the next time you reincarnate, that there's no necessary condition to be connected. However, and especially in the West, it seems people have memories of reincarnating into the same family or time or town. The Tlingit, I know I didn't say that right, sorry, Alaskans have strong belief that you reincarnate into the same family. But Asian Indians believe you never do. Dr. Stevenson was able to decipher what he defined as a reincarnation blueprint. And people usually share 3 or 4 of these next characteristics when they have a past life memory. The first is the prediction of rebirth. Um, for example, if you're an old person and you're having a memory, you may, and this happens especially in Native American cultures, you may pick out your new parents and predict, I'm going to be born to that couple over there in the next town over. And lo and behold, you'll die, and then they do have a child with some similar characteristics. Now, confirmation bias, keep that in mind. The other characteristic that's common in many of these stories is the prediction in a dream called an announcing dream. A pregnant woman will have a dream that the child she's about to have will be a reborn person who comes to her and tells her, I'm going to be your baby when I'm born. I had an announcing dream about one of my daughters, but it wasn't about her being in past life, but it was a description of her gender, what she looked like, what she would be like, and they were spookily true. And it was before I knew I was pregnant. It's very interesting. People with birthmarks or birth defects, in fact, a third of the cases this was a factor, will claim that these were from previous injuries in a former life. Now, it's more likely to be looked for in certain cultures. The Tinglet and the Igbo in Nigeria and in Burma, these are the cultures that believe heavily in this. Some cultures don't look for it at all because they don't expect it. They don't expect the reincarnation of somebody known already. And sometimes these marks will be a mark, and then in the past life memory, they'll realize they were stabbed in that area in the past life. So these past life memories, it's commonly found that they start around 2 to 4 years old when people become really verbal, and they go on to about 8 years old, and after that, the child starts to get confused about what really happened or what they think they remember. Or they may feel conflicting loyalties because they miss their former family from the past life and they feel conflicted. Another characteristic of these memories is often people will recognize people and places from the past. There's a frequent occurrence of violent death in the past life. In fact, violent death seems to almost be part and parcel of past life memories. And as we'll discover later, a question is asked, does the trauma imprint the memory? But this seems counterintuitive to how memory works, because you require the ability to store things, and which we'll talk about. Another characteristic is unusual behavior related to a past life and not now, like behaviors that coincide better with a different gender or with a completely different culture or a different time period. For example, phobias can be related to memories of a past death, food taste or the style of food that somebody likes, craving or refusing alcohol or tobacco, a longing for a past family that's remembered, attachment to previous types of work, odd sexual behavior towards a previous spouse, as in a 4-year-old who meets somebody that they claim is a former spouse and is like inappropriate with them. That's been recorded. Jealous of a second wife or a second husband after the death of the person they claim they were. People who identify with the gender of the former life that's not the same as the gender of this life. Skills or talents that are not taught to the person, but that they knew in a former life and seem to remember, like a language or a musical instrument or some kind of craft or technical ability. And then there appear to be cultural differences. In India, most Hindus and Buddhists, Jains, and Sikhs believe in reincarnation. In Burma, Myanmar, Buddhists believe that karma results in payback in a future life. And usually they believe they reincarnate as the same gender and as a relative of the past person that they were. They have frequent announcing dreams and frequently find birthmarks and defects. They look for them. And it's very common in Myanmar to remember a previous life. In Thailand, where they're Buddhist, they have fewer incidents of reincarnation into the same family. There's a gradual accumulation of merit through the deeds that you do in your life, and this merit is carried over into the next life. So they will attribute a person's particular good behavior as a result of a previous life. Sri Lankans tend to be, the Tamils are Hindu and the rest of them tend to be Buddhist. They don't have as many announcing dreams. It's not common there. In Turkey, the Alevis, I don't know how to pronounce it, are a form of Shiite Muslim, and they don't believe that when you reincarnate, you bring with you the impact of your past behavior. And they think that you reincarnate into the same gender you were before. People in Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Jordan, some people all believe in reincarnation. The Druze, who are Shiites, they think it's a very important factor in life that children are all asked to try to remember their past lives. And that a large number of children, therefore, claim to be born with memories of a past life. They believe that reincarnation from your sudden death to a newborn happens immediately, and you're always the same gender. The Tlingit in Alaska, most have converted to Christianity, but they retain their native tradition, and that includes a belief in reincarnation as the same gender. You don't ever reincarnate into an animal. You can wish now for things to be happier in your next life, and you may actually receive that. Like, I hope I have better parents, that kind of thing. They believe that birthmarks are common and the signs of rebirth, and also they have announcing dreams. The Haida in British Columbia and Alaska also converts to Christianity. Also, their tradition includes reincarnation, and they believe in a thing called soul splitting, where your soul can be divided into two different bodies at the same time. The Igbo in Nigeria, also Christian and traditionally believe in reincarnation. I try to identify the soul of a newborn by examining it for birthmarks. They try to figure out who it used to be. Sex change from one life to another is common and acceptable, and reincarnating into the same family line is common. They have a thing called repeater children. So if a baby dies as an infant, that soul that didn't get the opportunity will come back into the same family. Stevenson, in his surveys, was able to find only 12% of cases had gender changes. 3 times the number of girls were willing to say they had been boys. Boys were reluctant to say they'd been girls in a former life. Is this a cultural prejudice? Only in Myanmar was the number who became women larger. Boys were twice as likely to claim a violent death, and women in Asia were the least likely to remember a violent death. They were also, women in Asia, less likely to talk about reincarnation because they're culturally expected to not draw attention to themselves. The Igbo in Nigeria is a very male-dominated culture, and they pay much more attention to boys' stories, so they don't really record the girls' stories. And there doesn't seem to be any prediction of socioeconomic line from one life to another. No connection. Reincarnation in the West is not believed by mainstream Christians. They think that your soul awaits resurrection of the body to be joined up again. In the late 70s, about 30% of Westerners claimed that they believed in reincarnation, and in 1999 it was only 33%. Could not find what it is today. It's far less likely of a belief in Western Christian people. Talking about it is discouraged. Not too many people have studied it. Dr. Stevenson compared 1979 American children to 1979 Indian children from India. And most Americans came from families that did not believe in reincarnation, whose parents were uncomfortable with the idea, and who silenced the children. Most of them were Christian from small towns with only a high school degree, and only about a third of them showed any interest or understanding of reincarnation at all. In India, they studied 266 children, and 75% of them named a previous life identity and that were able to be verified, that there was somebody by that name. In America, so that's 75% in India, and only 34% in America, usually a close relative, as in, well, I'm a reincarnation of my grandmother. I don't think I am, but in India, only 16% of children believe they're reincarnated from close relatives. They start talking about it around 3 years old. American kids start talking about it at about the same age, but stop at 5, a little earlier than in India, where they stop at 7 or 8. They make the same number of statements about it, 14 roughly, factual statements that can be checked. The manner of death, and there's a connection between phobias the children have and the type of death they had, or the cause of death. And the more violent it is, the more vivid these memories are. Greater number of American kids were opposite gender, 15%. And mostly the girls were willing to admit they formerly had been male. In Indians, only 3% changed gender. And of all of these people that I talked to, 0 claim to be somebody famous. Hindus and Buddhists do believe you can reincarnate as animals, but I got that wrong. They do believe that animals can reincarnate, but people rarely reincarnate as animals. Usually it's animal to animal. Westerners are more likely to remember reincarnation in another culture, sort of romanticizing this exotic remembrance. And the chance of verifying many of these stories is 0, because they happened, like claiming to be a Native American on the plains 300, 400, 500 years ago. It's impossible to verify stories like that. Trying to prove them and disprove them is very difficult, because most lives were unremarkable. They didn't claim to be anybody important. So the kinds of explanations they come out with for these stories is, well, are these children just really fantasy prone and have vivid imaginations? Do they have unconscious needs that are being met by these stories, like attention or whatever? Is it self-deception? Is it a fanciful fraud? Are they in a dissociative state of some sort? Is it just some inexplicable trick of memory? Is it just a remarkable similarity in genetic traits and cultural influences that have been ascribed to a past life? Is this memory, or is it genetics? And then the other explanation is parapsychology, that time is not linear, and that this is retrospective telepathy, which we'll get into. Jung believed in the collective consciousness, the collective unconsciousness. It was a shared consciousness, a shared memory pool. And then there was Sheldrake, who believed in the morphic resonance theory. And we discussed those when we talked about near-death experiences and dreams in the past. And their names are going to come up throughout this book, because there seems to be a real link between all of these phenomena. So that's the end of this video, video number 1. And we will start video number 2 with chapter 4 here in a second. And I will start uploading this, and I'll be back. I'm going to try to get this done tonight. It shouldn't be too much. It's not terribly long, because a lot of these stories in this book, I didn't actually go through the whole life story of the person. It was just way too difficult to condense and do it justice. You'll have to read the book. So, thank you for watching. It's Lancha, and I'll be back in a minute.